Sylvie knows who Loki is? Obi is Himothy when it comes to the tech, and Mobius is on a jet ski. Everything is right in the world. Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to The Grid, and this is a breakdown of Loki Season 2, Episode 5, and here we are unpacking how and when Loki got his time-slipping powers, and as per usual with this series, we have a lot to talk about and not a lot of time. Let's ride. Again, it is very important to pay close attention to the recap of this episode, specifically the
I paved the road.
This time, the full fanfare comes back, but now going through it after episode 4 feels a bit different, as if we're revisiting something that might actually not be what we think. And now everyone is gone, which we reveal through the point of view of Loki.
You're gone, baby, you're gone. Girl, you're gone.
As we leave the core area that once displayed the spaghettification percentage on the floor. And as we walk down the hallway, we see a series of numbers which have doubles, 66, 55, and 33, which seem to help signify the perceived effect of reality versus what's actually happening. And the route we now take is the same route that Mobius introduced us to when he introduced all of us to the pie area, also known as the automat. And all the pie is all gone. And as we pass the time theater area, we get a newly colored siren light, which used to be orange. And we hear the intercom come on, which sounds like it's actually being turned on as Loki enters this area. And then we hear the first onset of time slipping, but we don't go anywhere. But Loki reacts as if the version that we are currently seeing right now has had this happen multiple times. So at the beginning, I had a question of, is this the same Loki that we have been experiencing from the beginning of this, or since episode 2 at this point? And then he actually does time slip into a past future version of himself, which is reading the Time Variance Authority Handbook, which now somehow kind of signifies to me that time slipping seems to be a way of a compass, or at least at the beginning, it seemed like a compass of sorts. Well, you know, one more shameless plug. You knew it was coming anyway. I'm just gonna have to put it on out here because I need you to hit that like button for me, because when you do, it spreads all over the YouTube, and you know your boy likes to feel that. It just feels so good. It makes me feel all kinds of warm fuzzies and stuff. Anyway, if you would do your boy a solid, hit the like button, fist bump the like button for me, and then if the theories that I'm breaking down inside of if you're picking up what I'm putting down inside of this here video in terms of the theories, send it to your people. And the monitor now shows the loom in its critical state before imploding, which then again when he goes back is confirmed by the same voice over the intercom, and it's also eerily silent. But to me, it now seems a bit more clear as to what Loki's time slipping actually is and what it's for. It's a compass to what he should be doing or paying attention to. And as everything starts to disintegrate, what he understands is that he needs the TVA handbook for what he just doesn't understand yet. And as we bleed into the new timeline and the Loki title card, we can hear what sounds like a reversed version of the main Loki theme. And then the letters just started disappearing. Like, that's not a huge Easter egg, but it was a very subtle and slight move, but big at the same time for me. And when the letters come back, it's completely whole and no longer shapeshifting, which the entire sequence feels like a nod to the fact that his old nature is completely gone, or is fading away, and his new nature is something we've never seen before. And as the title card lifts, Casey is shown inside of a prison, specifically inside of a prison cell underneath a dummy, which is later revealed to be a branched timeline in San Francisco in 1962, specifically on the grounds of Alcatraz, which is also later confirmed by Casey in a later scene. And Casey is now revealed to be Frank on the timeline. And judging by this scene, this is Frank Morris we're talking about here, who was a part of a 3-man convict group who escaped from their cells in 1962. And at the beginning of the scene, we can see what they used to fool the guards in order to escape from their cells. Dummy heads made out of plaster, skin tone paint, and human hair. Then, as Loki time slips through multiple different places, we see two distinct points of interest in his travels: Sylvie's McDonald's and Mobius's dealership. And we also see two scenes from the trailers: the parking lot of the dealership with the blow-up noodle and the time theater that Loki ends up in. B-15 is then shown in 2012 in New York, which is the same exact time frame of the battle in New York, which means that possibly B-15 might have seen or heard of Loki in the past. And this also now calls back to what Sylvie showed her and what she says about being happy on the timeline. But after seeing Loki time slip in front of her, which again, this version may or may not know him at all, but she may have an idea of who he is because of the battle in New York. But after seeing this, she don't look that happy. Then what we have all been waiting for this entire time since the beginning of this series, Mobius on a jet ski, and his actual name on the timeline is Dawn. And though I originally thought this would have been set in the early 90s or late 90s for that matter, it's actually set in 2022. Go figure. And as I have been speculating across the entirety of this channel, he is a jet ski salesman.
Well, they say the personal watercraft is kind of the thinking man's dirt bike.
But notice the fan on the left of the jet ski, which kind of seems like a nod to Loki's time slipping, especially because at this point we know it's coming, we just don't know exactly when. And the subtle touch of Loki acting like a blow-up noodle as his arms flail in the air as he time slips into the scene, classic. Loki then says to Mobius, "You're here," which is a dope moment for both Loki and the audience because we realize now that Mobius actually got to his jet skis like he said he wanted to.
You know where I go if I could go anywhere, wherever it is I'm really from, and wherever I had a life before the TVA came along. That's what I'd like to do, just ride around on my jet ski.
But Loki knows there's way more at stake than just jet skis. And I love the moment that Loki has with Mobius, which basically signifies that he does not know him, which seems like a callback to the first episode of this season when Mobius actually says, "I don't know you." And Mobius is a dad. Well, Don Mobius is a dad of two sons. Now, this was a sticking point for me because of what Sylvie told him in the previous episode, in episode 4, specifically saying to him that he found out that he's a variant, but never looked into his timeline. So that made me think, why? And I have more of a breakdown on what exactly is happening with Mobius later on in the video because there's more to unpack here. But something happens with Mobius and his sons, and more specifically his entire family, that he doesn't want to come back to. We are then taken to 1994 on a branched timeline again in Pasadena, California, the home of the Rose Bowl, where at the beginning of the scene, I thought that this could be Obi, and I was actually right. And we also understand now why Obi is such a prolific author inside of the TVA. But similar to inside of the TVA, we can also see that not many people read his actual books because the owners of the store that he is trying to sell his book in don't want him to sell his book there. However, in the shot that displays the books at the counter, you can see a Tom Clancy Debt of Honor on the shelves, which, by the way, itself is a sci-fi techno thriller, which is possibly something close to what Obi would have been reading and writing himself. So the store owners have a little bit of knowledge in terms of sci-fi, but unless you're fully known, they don't want your book inside their store. And this is also right before Amazon opens its doors. Obi is a little ahead of the game. And we now have our sighting of the sticky board wall, which occurs inside of the credits, which is now shown to belong to Obi's variant. The lab that the variant is currently inside of looks very similar to what Obi's lab looks like inside of the TVA, even down to the large drum in the center of the room at the back. And we get the line from the trailer that is now confirmed to be directed at Obi.
What I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to believe.
Obi's variant, who I am now going to call the author, now believes Loki to be the embodiment of his actual story, the Sons of Urin, to which Loki says,
"You are a writer.
Yes.
I'm doomed."
when he figures out that the author is just a storyteller at this point and not a scientist yet. But the plot thickens when the author says that he also has a PhD in physics, just to keep a day job so that he can write at night, and his day job is a teacher or a professor teaching physics at Caltech. What? Which now shines a light on how Obi got his intelligence. And the author's explanation of time slipping seems to be the reason why he gets named Ouroboros. He details that because Loki has time slipped into a place that does not have time anymore, he should be able to go back to a place or a similar place that does not have time either, because in essence, that would be infinity, which the symbol for Ouroboros is actually used to symbolize infinity, which Loki then mentions that that doesn't sound like science because it doesn't, but the author's response is key because it does sound like fiction. So, is the entirety of the TVA the work of science fiction? In the next shot, we can get another nod to the fact that the author's home is built exactly the same as Obi's office, and the amount of books present here are possibly the reasoning why all of those file cabinets are actually available outside of Obi's office, because he has to put those books somewhere. From here, we get our first look at what pruning, or the prototype of pruning, comes from, which oddly enough is a taser, and that is why the tip of the time stick glows. Then the author goes through a bunch of theoretical situations that could cause time slipping, then explaining why and how time slipping becomes a thing for Loki. Everyone has a temporal aura, and it can potentially be followed through time and timelines, which then getting a group of auras together in the same space would then allow for a tighter time slipping destination so that you could go pinpoint exactly where you wanted to go. But the author states that what he's proposing right now is pretty much impossible because the tech is just not available in his lifetime, which seems like a character trait that comes from or inside of all of Obi's variants, because Obi actually has a similar situation in episode 4.
Keep in mind that I'm an artist and I'm sensitive about mine.
Which Loki now remembers having the TVA handbook, which he picked up earlier in the episode, which again calls back to the fact that time slipping is a sort of compass directing Loki to places where he should be directing his attention, which is possibly why he didn't at first when he time slipped to the portion of himself reading the TVA handbook, why he didn't see the disintegration happening at that moment, because then his perspective is only on reaching the TVA handbook and not looking for anything else. Loki then time slips to Mobius's home, where we find out through context why he hasn't looked inside of his timeline, and this is what I was alluding to earlier in the video. So here's the full explanation on what I believe happened to Mobius.
Warning, incoming Kang.
His wife has now died or left him, and now he is a single dad with 2 sons. And we also hear where the drinking with Ravonna situation now comes from, because he offers Loki a beer similar to what he would have done with Ravonna inside of the TVA. Obi then shows up through a time door using a TemPad that he created in 18 to 19 months. But this means that the author's theory of the connection to temporal auras and time slipping is real, because at this point it shows that you can track someone with their temporal aura even if that person does not have a TemPad. And then Loki tells Don Mobius,
What's happening?
I promise you this will make sense.
which is the exact same thing that he told Sylvie in the hallway after pruning himself at the elevator.
I promise you this will make sense.
And as they travel through another time door, you can kind of see the instability of the tech the author has constructed here, because he hasn't fully corrected the time traveling tech just yet, as you can see from the floating time door over his head. Loki then explains to Don, or Don Mobius as we're calling him now, that the reality that he's been experiencing through time so far is not what has always been, because he then reminds him that Mobius himself said to him, the TVA is the only life that Mobius has ever known. So With this one line, there's a question that is now raised. Is the current experience for Mobius the consequence of the loom exploding at the end of episode 4? Or is this a completely new Mobius that we've never experienced before? Loki then shows Don Mobius that he can access this point in time at any point that he would like to, then showing the replay of what just happened moments earlier inside of his yard, which now is the uncovered reason of going through the time door in the first place. That seems like a foreshadowing situation because it kind of backfires later on in the episode. We then get a plot twist as Loki sets out to find Sylvie once again, because when he arrives inside of her timeline after time slipping to that place, she already knows who he is. But we are tipped off to the fact that this is not a safe place to be in, and also the fact that she will know or does know who Loki is, or why she knows who Loki is, because her food disappears in the beginning of the scene. And this signified to me that during the explosion of the loom, Sylvie left through a time door. Then in the conversation at the bar, we uncover that both of them have developed or continue to have developed their selfish nature, because Sylvie now wants to live and just experience life because she never has up until this point, and Loki wants his friends back because he's never had that and doesn't want to be alone. At the end of this scene, we get our first direct look at the fact that something is completely wrong now when Loki's drink is gone, because that's the second time that has happened in the succession of them meeting at the McDonald's to the time that they leave each other. Frank is quite enamored with the technology of the TemPad because he believes or possibly wants to use it to rob a bank, because he asked Obi, or the author that we are formerly known as Obi at this point.
Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
Then the guitar monkey from the credits is shown inside of a record store, and the song playing in the background is Love Don't Live Here Anymore by Rolls Royce, which is fittingly placed directly after the bar scene, because now Loki is alone, which also stays inside of the 70s synth styled theme, say that 10 times fast, and music tones of the show. Then Sylvie grabs a record suggested by her friend inside of the record store, who by the way happens to be the owner, and she is the only regular. And the disappearing food acts that I mentioned before now come full circle when she plays the song, and in the background you can see another person coming into the door and then disintegrates immediately, further tearing down the entirety of that timeline, including her friend. And in this scene, my suspicion from earlier in the video is confirmed. Sylvie did leave the imploding of the loom the same way that she's leaving now, through a time door. Loki then breaks the news to the Reset crew that he basically just sold them packed drink. But Don Mobius has a few questions though, similar in Mobius fashion as he would, about what he said in terms of his boys. Loki mentioned that his boys were in trouble, so now he wants a full explanation on what the heck are you talking about now. And now with the ending in mind, what he tells him about being able to bring him back to the moment in time that he mentioned before, now that makes a lot more sense, because Loki could do this from jump. It's how things even started in terms of us seeing the TVA in the first place, but it's a power that he didn't really know that he had, or at least not in the way that he has it now. And I'm saying that because he used to believe, or kind of still at this moment believes, that he has to go through the time doors in order to move through time, but he actually doesn't. Add to this fact that he tried to use a similar, lesser type of power though in the beginning of the series, specifically in episode 1 of season 1, when he stood trial for his offenses against the timeline and attempts to disappear out of it.
Of this.
Hang on. Everyone quiet.
He's trying to use his powers, ma'am.
Then when Sylvie arrives out of her time door after experiencing what she just experienced, the reset plan is kickstarted, but with a twist. But by the way, this confirms the connection between what the author was talking about earlier regarding temporal auras, having the ability to pinpoint and then connect to them, which now is in fact a real thing because Sylvie literally did the exact same thing just now to find where Loki and the rest of the crew actually were. She had no idea where they were and she hadn't been there before at all. So this confirms for me that temporal auras can be used as a potential locking point or potential pin drop to find and then move inside of the timeline. And inside of this scene, the first red flag that is then set off that everything is not the way that it's supposed to be is when the crew goes looking for the temp pad, believing that it was Frank who took it and they can't find it, and then he disappears along with it. And as everything starts to unravel around Loki, including the rest of his crew, you can then hear Sylvie say, "There's nowhere else left to go," which then signifies to me that every other timeline that we experienced before is now gone and she has nowhere to go. That's why she disintegrates here, because there's no place else for her to run. Also, remember that the author mentioned that time slipping is because of a why. Why do you want to go to this particular place? But we uncover later that the actual situation is because of a who. This now leads me into the explanation of why and how Loki is even able to stay stable inside of all this chaos that is happening around him. And you can also hear voices or previous conversations that he's had as the fabric of time starts to disintegrate around him. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he had the ability to do this even on a smaller scale since the beginning of the time that he experienced the TVA, though at this point he was using the Tesseract as a powering source. Being inside of the TVA though has now stunted his free use of magic, meaning that he would now have to learn a new way of circumventing what goes on inside the TVA and possibly on the timeline in general. Adding more to this, his knowledge of the Infinity Stones and the power that they possessed now has changed, given the fact of what was said in season 1 about the Infinity Stones. Now, during and through his time at the TVA, and more specifically during the moment with He Who Remains, he gets as close as he's ever been to the new source of his power, his love for Sylvie and the need not to be alone. And I know that there's a theory going around that there's a possibility that he has access to the Time Stone, which is enabling him to do this. But we haven't seen enough to support that he has it with him at present. And again, those are said to be useless at this point anyway. And if I'm wrong, wouldn't be the first time, and it'll probably happen again, but the more you know. And just a slight aside here, the Marvel editors think they slick, but you ain't, cause I caught you. If you stuck around for the ending credits, you would have seen that the lines that separate the titles and the actual names of the people that work or that worked on this project are now starting to branch off and bend a little bit, which they did not do that before. Now, there's a huge clue that I believe that none of us have been talking about at this point, because Loki has been inside of the same jacket since episode 2. So does that mean